one time is something that I mean, we need to call it out. I fully believe we need to call that out. But sometimes I've seen other people, and I've had other leaders tell me, they're like, oh, so-and-so is posting again. And they've just become everybody now sends it to them, whatever their issue is, any hint of spiritual abuse whatsoever. How do we help that? I mean, what do we do with that? Is it a good thing? Is it a bad thing? How do we evaluate these types of ministries that have built up to call it out? Like you said, you want to be the first to help further the conversation. But is there a point in time where you start seeing abuse in the shadows everywhere you go? How do we hold those two things in tension?
Yeah, well, they will be in tension. And, as I indicated already, these two extremes are out there, which is the extreme that doesn't think abuse is a problem at all. And then another extreme that says they finds it everywhere. And we've got to find a way to have a healthy balance between those two. It's interesting. Each extreme thinks the solution is there. So the extreme that says there's spiritual abuse is not a problem, the idea is never talk about it. And the group that says spiritual abuse is everywhere, that's all they want to talk about. And so I'm trying to create in my book, and hopefully I've gotten close to this, a healthy balance between those two extremes. Watchdog websites are complicated things. People ask me a lot about these. What do I think about them? And I have a mixed reaction. I want to acknowledge on the one side that someone like a Ravi Zacharias would probably still be in ministry today if it wasn't for somebody out there on the internet saying, hey, this isn't right. We need to address this, and we're not going to stop until someone does, because no one would listen to the leaders in the organization when they brought up the red flags. So in one sense, you could say, well, those sites did really good stuff. And on the flip side, I think we could all think of sites that probably are unhealthily obsessed with some of this, and maybe are just passing along every little hint without any sort of verification. So I don't have a solution for you, and I think this is part of the complicated age we live in. I think, sweeping declarations about websites in general are hard to make. I think it depends on the site, depends on the person, depends on what they're saying, depends on so many factors. But I think we can acknowledge that both those problems are out there and we want to address them.
Taking that into consideration, you're talking about, let's take it a little bit further. I know of some Watchdog websites that are out there that have looked for independent verification, then they present the material to bring that out. I think of the Elephant's Debt. When James McDonald was going on, they had all these different things that were there. And then counter accusations started flying of, hey, these people are insubordinate, they're lacking trust, they're not violating the biblical principles and the process. What are the principles that you've noticed, or the responses of the accused when such things are brought to their attention that we need to be aware of so that we can recognize them when we see them?
In terms of tactics that are trying to be defensive for people who are abusive. Yeah. So I've got a chapter in my book on sort of, what I call flipping the script, where someone comes and says, hey, this guy, this leader is really wielding his authority in a domineering manner. We need to address that. Unfortunately, rarely is there a sense in which, we're going to embrace that, receive that, and really investigate that. Rather, instead, all these sort of policies kick in, all these sort of strategies kick in to try to deflect the problem. And this is part of what I wanted to point out, and I hope the church can learn from that, which is we don't want to do that. I mean, it can be a lot of things. It can be reverse accusations against the accuser, right? Go after their character. They're the real problem. It could be sort of like, oh, well, you didn't follow the proper process, Matthew 18. And so, it's like a Miranda rights. You didn't read me my rights, so therefore I get out of jail free type of thing. That happens a lot. There's one of the most common things is that when concerns are brought up, the leader says, oh, that's slander. You're slandering me. And then it looks like that the people who brought up the concerns are the bad guys now, right? They're the ones on trial. So these sorts of tactics are common. They're sad. And I point them out in the book, and I think we need to learn how to watch out for those when these things are brought up.
How do we create cultures where this is not, where it's more recognized, where we can identify it quicker so that it doesn't happen? Right now there's a lot of reaction. There's a lot of reaction that's going on across the board, and we've seen it go in the negative. Pastors losing their jobs, and negative in a good sense, in that these things needed to be called out. They were guilty of these egregious things that have been done and scarred innumerable people in the process and defamed the name of Christ. How do we, though, create cultures where this abuse is identified and dealt with in a proper manner?
Yeah, I spent a lot of time in my last chapter of my book trying to at least throw out some suggestions on that score. I mean, it's so much bigger than one
Yeah.
chapter. Obviously, I think there's two layers to this. There's what do we do with abusive pastors once they are sort of found out, and how do we listen to the victims and act a real investigation and reach healthy conclusions and true conclusions. But what I tried to do in that last chapter too is say, I think we need to back the problem up one notch. It's not as simple as just prosecuting bad pastors when they misbehave, although you do have to do that eventually. But rather, how do we change it downstream, or rather, I should say upstream, before it gets to you, so that the type of people who are entering ministry, the type of people who are attracted to ministry, the type of people that churches are looking for are set up in such a way that it sort of self-weeds out potentially abusive leaders. And I think we need to give more attention to character and character analysis. I think we need to give more attention to sort of setting up a structure around the leader that has real accountability and also a teamwork orientation, not hierarchical and autocratic. And so I mentioned a number of these things. But this is what I meant a minute ago, and I said we got to kind of rebuild the whole system, because some people just say, well, look, I mean, if there's a bad leader, prosecute him. What's the problem? I'm like, no, you're missing the point. We are feeding these guys into the system. And it's not as simple to just say we can just prosecute when we find out about them. We need to find a way to stop them from getting in there in the first place. And I think that's where we have to recalibrate what a pastor looks like and who should be in ministry. And that's going to take a lot more work than just simply prosecuting the bad guys when we find out about them.
Well, I agree. And that's where I think it becomes much more difficult, because you and I both know that person could be removed and they're going to find another church that's willing to give them a shot.
And church, if the culture of the church hasn't changed, is going to hire the next abusive guy that comes along.
Yeah.
So, yeah. And so both are problems. That same abusive leader is going to take a different church. And in the same church who got rid of them, if they're not affecting change in their culture, they're just going to end up with another big heavy-handed guy next time around.